Brethren, welcome to our Young and New Masons Extra. We have Martin Cherry, who is on our 11th social. He's come to answer the last remaining questions that we had, and we had quite a few that evening. So welcome, Martin. Thank you again for coming.
I am.
We'll get straight down to it. So one of the questions we got, Martin, is from Andy Morley from the Porchway Club in Derbyshire. And he asks, hi, Martin, is it right that there were a lot of travelling lodges during the war?
Yeah, the short answer is obviously yes, there were lots of travelling lodges. Both the colonial army, which was the Americans, and the British had travelling lodges. So, and I think they played a significant part in giving soldiers something to do during the war when they were off duty, because a lot of them were away from home, but also that they helped spread Freemasonry across the states. And there were significant people who were made Masons in these travelling lodges. So two good examples. James Monroe, who was the 5th president of the United States of America, he was actually made a Mason in a St. John's Regimental Lodge in the colonial army in 1775 when he was just 18 years old. Huh. And so he's one of the many American presidents who were Freemasons. It's interesting because they didn't have at that stage they didn't have an age limit on Freemasonry in the States, because although Franklin's copy of the Constitution said the 21 limit, it wasn't particularly widespread across the states. So not many, obviously he didn't make many copies, so they could make up as they went along. And another really good example is in Boston in 1774, where there was an Irish military lodge, and they initiated an African American called Prince Hall, and 13 other African Americans, and they went on to form something called Prince Hall Freemasonry, which is like a massive African American institution, hugely important in not only American Freemasonry but also in the civil rights movement in the States. Again, that is born in a military lodge during the independence period. So yes, yes, there definitely were military lodges on both sides.
That's great. In terms of the Prince Hall stuff, Martin, obviously slavery was quite a big problem at one point in America. Did that help at all in terms of giving some equality to men of colour back then?
It's interesting because obviously Prince Hall actually wrote some abolitionist material, but in the northern states where slavery didn't exist, it was something that was definitely a helpful thing. I mean, Prince Hall Freemason was quite big. It was probably more important, I mean, in the Civil War period. So have you seen the film Glory?
I haven't, no.
It's about one of the first black regiments in the Civil War. And it's a northern regiment, obviously, but Prince Hall Freemasons apparently did a really good job of recruiting for that regiment. So so a lot of Prince Hall Freemasons joined it, but also they did a lot to try and encourage black North Americans to go and fight against the Confederacy. In the civil rights era, so in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the NCCP, the National Society for the Advancement of Coloured People, they did a lot of them would meet in Prince Hall lodges. So they'd use the same buildings, because that would be the only sort of African American building often in the town. So when they were going and travelling, it would give them a base. And obviously, and even earlier you had people like William Dubois, who was the founder of that. He was a Prince Hall Mason, and Booker T. Washington, who was like a black American who set up lots of universities in southern states. He was a Prince Hall Freemason. So it's always had this sort of association with the civil rights movement. So it's quite interesting. And Prince Hall Masons are really fascinating. All the ones I've met have always been ex-military.
All right.
But they're incredibly proud black Americans, and they're really proud of their own history and Prince Hall Freemasonry's history. Really interesting organisation.
Well, I guess as well, because America was such a new country and it was colonized by so many different countries as well, that, you know, organizations such as Freemasonry and other organizations as well probably would be quite a prominent way to access things, get things done, and everything else in between as well.
Yeah. There's a really interesting book by a Freemason and academic called Roger Burt, and it's about coal miners and tin and gold miners and mariners, and it's about the sort of it's mostly about the 19th century, and it's about mostly he's interested in Cornish tin miners, but who became Freemasons, and they went across to the gold fields of the west coast of America and to South Africa as well. And often in these towns, one of the first things that would be built after they built a church and a school would be a Masonic hall. Right. And these miners were, I mean, they were using it, they were fantastic networkers, but they joined Freemasonry in Cornwall when the sort of mining industry wasn't doing very well, because they knew that if they went to the States, they'd be able to use their Masonic connection. But it would give them a friend when they got there, but also they think they'd be able to make contact with other miners who are Freemasons, and so you often got these gold fields with like a tented city, but they would have a saloon and a church and a Masonic hall in them. And we got some lovely pictures of South African Masonic halls from the same period. And often they're like tin shacks because they've been built in like shanty towns that were developing where the gold fields were.
That's amazing. I imagine being a fly in the wall back in those days. It'd be a bit of a sight, wouldn't it, I think? Our next one, Martin, is from Gary Logie from Sarsen Club, and he asks, as part of the initiation, each Freemason pledges to abide by the laws of the country in which they find themselves. How, therefore, did Freemasonry as an organisation react to so many Masons conducting what would have been considered illegal acts of high treason? Yeah,
that's a funny one. There is actually sort of an answer to that in Franklin's Constitution. I'll see if I can share screen. This is a really bad image that's a page from Franklin's Constitutions, and it's in Anderson's Constitutions as well. There's a bit where they got the charges of the stonemasons, which is basically what the charges of Freemasons, so the rules of Freemasonry are based on. And they've got this one about so that if a brother should be a rebel against the state, he's not to be countenanced in his rebellion. However, he may be pitted as an unhappy man, and if convicted of no other crime through the loyal brotherhood, must and ought to disown his rebellion and give no umbrage or grounds of political jealousy to the government for the time being. They cannot expel him from the lodge, and his relation to it remains indefeasible. So basically what they're saying is he should be pitted, but he shouldn't be condemned for it. So he's not being it's somehow the treason doesn't seem to carry the weight of some other crimes. I don't know, because it was all those sort of I guess they don't want people not to rise up against despots, or say if you've got a bad government or something. But it's interesting because obviously Anderson's Constitutions was written in 1723 in London by Freemasons who were basically part of the Hanoverian ruling class in London, and it was at the time you just had a Jacobite rebellion in Scotland which was trying to overthrow the government. So you'd have thought they'd have put something in the Constitution saying that treason's a really bad thing, rebelling against the state, but for some reason they didn't, and I guess that was their get out clause.
Well, do you think back then really that the obligation that people take to come into Masonry was really just more of like a theatrical thing? I mean, in terms of it actually really happening?
I think it was mainly the sort of moral things of not committing crimes or not acting against the people in your lodge, but also in your society. And it's more of a sort of I guess it's more of a sort of a local acting with you. If you committed a real crime, you'd be in big trouble. You would be kicked out of Freemasonry.
Yeah, but it was more the punishments that obviously that you could potentially have through your obligation. I just don't know whether that was more something to keep the moral standards kind of how they wanted it, rather than that would actually happen or not. So our next one, Martin, is from Dan Cook from Northamptonshire and Huntingdonshire New and Young Masons Club, and he asks, what's the most interesting thing that if you have come across in the library at Freemasons Hall, or I guess any library?
Oh God, that's a really difficult one, because It's a bit like asking what your favourite album is and you ain't know about 20.
Yeah.
There's always things that I really love and come across and think, oh, that's because I love the book that I talked about in the lecture. So because of its provenance, the fact that it was owned by, we know nearly everyone who owned that book, and the fact that Ben Franklin must have touched it at some point.
Yeah.
But there's other things. There's a minute book from a lodge called the Cappadocia Lodge of Instruction. It's only a little tiny minute book, that sort of size. It's like a small exercise book. And the Cappadocia Lodge of Instruction was formed in 1918 by prisoners of war in Yozgad in Turkey. So it's a prisoner of war camp right in the middle of Turkey. And they were English and Australian soldiers who'd been captured at, I think, in Mesopotamia, and they'd been marched into the centre of Turkey. And they were mostly officers and people who'd escaped from other camps they were put in this camp. And it was a weird camp because it had no walls, and they were allowed to go into the local town to go shopping, and they were allowed to have lots of clubs and things, because there was no way you were going to escape from the middle of Turkey, because it was almost a desert area where they were, and if you got killed, the bandits if you escaped, the bandits would probably kill you, or the locals would. So they were pretty much free to do what they wanted. So some of them formed a lodge of instruction, and they kept minutes. And it's really nice. So you see there's examples of what they did. So one of them gives a lecture about Masonic jewels, and the book's full of little drawings that he did of them, so to illustrate his lecture. And there's also a bit about one of the members of the Lodge of Instruction was a man called E.H. Jones, and he wrote a famous book after the war called The Road to Endor, which is about his attempt to escape from this prisoner of war camp by pretending to be insane. And it was all about he pretended he could be a medium, and him and an Australian guy, they basically they fooled the Turkish guards into believing that there was Armenian gold that they could help recover. But to do that, I'd have to fake their own insanity to get to. And the idea was eventually, if they were thought they were insane, they'd be shipped home. But they went to really extreme lengths, like they were doing these seances, but they also at one point they pretended to hang themselves, but it nearly backfired. So the Turkish guards only just caught them before they actually died, and they were sent to mental hospitals in Istanbul. And
would that be any worse or better than this?
Well, they were eventually freed and sent home on a boat to Britain, but then the war ended about a week later. So I think they went through like sort of 10 months of torment. But he's vaguely mentioned in the Lodge minutes, because at one point he can't come to the meeting. They said, so Brother Jones can't come to tonight's meeting because he's confined to barracks for committing. I think it's like committing talks with somebody from the spirit world. So there's some lovely stuff in there. The really sad thing, though, is the guy who wrote the minutes is this guy called Captain Roy Sweet. And right at the end of it, there's a note by another guy called Ernest Dunn saying that Sweet died in a flu epidemic that hit the camp just after the war was declared over. So it's quite poignant, but it's a really nice little book, and it's sort of a nice example of sort of Freemasonry under sort of duress, because even though that they were in this camp, they still wanted to do their Freemasonry. And it's even nice that they talk about their charity. So they have a charitable donation to Armenian families, because the Armenians were persecuted by the Turks during the war. In fact, to the genocide against them, but they basically raised money to give to all the men had been killed or taken away, so there was like Armenian women and children in the town, so they basically had a whip round with any money they had to give to give them some food, which is amazing, because they were prisoners of war. So I really like that, and it's a really nice little object. I also like anything to do with cricket. So anything that I find in the collection that's to do with cricket, I get momentarily excited about. So one of my other talks, I did one about Yorkshire treasures, and we got some Masonic jewels that belonged to Herbert Sutcliffe, who was a Yorkshire cricketer during the 20s and 30s, brilliant batsman. In fact, he's got the highest average for an England Test cricketer ever, so he averaged about 60 in Test cricket. But he's bizarrely got, he was London Freemason, even though he's a Yorkshire cricketer through and through. But we got some of his lodge jewels and his London Crown rank jewel, which is interesting. And Wally Hammond, who is one of his contemporaries, we've got his apron pouch, which I was really excited when we bought it. No one else was, but I was. but anything to do with cricket, I get really excited about, and then everyone else shouts me down and want to carry on. But I will do a talk on Freemasonry and cricket at some point. I need to write one, but yeah. And I've got one other thing that I really like, which I have got a picture of, which I can share, which is, sorry, is this this tracing board, which it belongs to Arts and Aldersgate Lodge, and they were formerly called, well, it was formerly the Arts Lodge. It's two more lodges that merged, but the Arts Lodge was a lodge that was formed in, I think, 1899 by a group of artists. So they were all the members were either painters or sculptors, and this was their first tracing board, which was made by a painter called John Cook. But he also worked with a metal worker and enamellist who used to share a studio with, called Nelson Dawson, who's also a member of the lodge, and a woodworker called something Knox. But basically they were early initiates to the lodge, and they made a set of 3 tracing boards. But you can't really tell it from this picture, because you take a photograph of something and it just looks flat, but the board isn't flat, it's sort of slightly curved, and all the features on it are embossed, and it's just a really lovely piece of arts and craft art. And it's also I get bored of tracing boards, because you see tracing boards and they always look the same, and there's hundreds of that. When the Emulation Lodge of Improvement basically chose their tracing boards, which were by John Harris, who was a good artist, they sort of standardized tracing boards for ages. And then Cook came along and did these really fantastic arts and craft one. And I just, you can't really appreciate them in the photograph, but I just really love them. And I really like the Arts Lodge. It's one of those, I wrote an article for a book about art and Freemasonry on the Arts Lodge. And I also, I was planning an exhibition, which we were going to do in April, but that's been postponed, on the arts and craft and Freemasonry. Because it's just one of the things I'm really interested in, is art history. My daughter's a fine arts student. It's one of the things we have in common, is we're both really interested in art. So when you come across something and I really appreciate the artwork in it, it's just, and I see it every day, because it's on display in the museum. But every time I walk past it, I still stop and look at it. It's really odd. But I just love it.
Imagine just how vibrant it is. I mean, particularly when it was first made. I mean, that black must have been really black in the gold, and it must have been absolutely stunning. I know that Bath Masonic Hall, they have their old. They have their old
huge ones, haven't they, on the floor?
And they're
really nice.
They really are. It's definitely worth having a look at those. Our next one is from a guy called Mitchell Bryant, whoever he is, and he put, "Why do you think Franklin is still such a prominent figure in American history, yet his Masonic history is largely left unmentioned?"
I think it's a couple of things. I think one of them is that his Freemasonry is one of his lesser achievements, really, because drafting the American constitutions, getting France's support for America during the War of Independence, being one of the people who drafted and signed the Declaration of Independence, all his scientific stuff. It's like, yeah, okay, his Freemasonry is interesting, but it's not the most important thing he did. I think it started to become so in America more, and American Freemasons are now are prouder of his Freemasonry now. So you see that American Freemasons are trying to redress that balance. So you'll get some of the American underground lodges, which something that the English don't do, is they do promotional videos. So they'll do, everything from becoming a Mason, and they run adverts on the telly. I've been in a hotel in the States and turned the telly on and seen an advert to become a Shriner, and you think, oh, that's really interesting. It's like recruitment. But and I have seen adverts where they've had Benjamin Franklin, or someone playing Benjamin Franklin, talking about Freemasonry and saying it's part in American history. So I think it's becoming more prominent. But there was a period when obviously the other things he did outweigh them by a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in talking about the Shriners as well, we had a Chief Raban on, Keith, from Arizona, and some of the stuff they do as well is just absolutely incredible. I mean, they raise just huge amounts of money, particularly with their hospitals and everything else they do as well.
And you think there's no, I mean, there's obviously no welfare state in America, and there's very little free healthcare. The Shriners Hospitals must be a sort of a massive godsend for some families, and you don't have to have any relationship with Freemasonry to get help from them, which is the other amazing thing about the Shriners Hospitals.
Yeah, absolutely. Our next one, Martin, is from Gav Jones from the Portray Club, Derbyshire, and he asks, does the Nicolas Cage film National Treasure search for hidden treasures? I'm sorry, I've got to step behind that. Is there much truth in that film? I'm trying to get at.
When I saw that question, I thought, yeah, that reminded me when I went to see it, because when it came out, we had an American guy working in the museum called Tim, and there was an Anglo-American lodge, and he became their first American initiate for years, and now he works in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, DC. He's their keeper of fraternal collections, so Freemason is one of his subjects. But he's also a member of Alexander Washington Lodge, which is one of the lodges that Washington was a member of, and it's the one that meets in the George Washington Memorial in the States. And we went to see National Treasure, and it was not long after he'd been initiated to Freemason, and we just sat there pissing ourselves laughing because it was just so funny. But it was almost like they were making like revelations about, oh look, from this you can see that this person was a master mason, and Tim was said, yeah, well, it's like, so I mean, obviously there were bits in it. Most of the people who they said were Freemasons in the film probably were Freemasons, but yeah.
It's a film at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a film and it was entertainment, but we enjoyed it.
So our next one, Martin, is from Mitch Bryant again, from Sarson's Club, and he asked, Martin, Franklin was so influential in every aspect of his many careers. What was it about Freemasonry that he revered so much, bearing in mind that the modern day Freemasonry was in its infancy?
I suspect when he became a Freemason initially, it was probably the networking opportunities locally, because he was a up and coming businessman, and I think he was interested in finding out who was in the lodge and what was going on. And he met people that would have been his contemporaries, so they were people in similar sort of businesses to him. I suspect he was probably attracted to his integrity. He probably liked the fact that they were open to other ideas, so they were interested. Especially when he went to France and he joined the Lodge of the Nine Muses in Paris, the fact that they were interested in Enlightenment ideas and science, and I think that would have definitely he would have been interested in that. But also I think the friendship aspect. So locally, yes, because one of the things I read about the lodge that he was a member of in Philadelphia was, everyone who's anyone has went to more important meetings of the lodge. So if you get people like the local governor being invited, and of course the publican whose public is being held, and publicans are often very important people locally. So and the fact they were reporting these meetings in his newspaper, it shows that people were interested. So it's obviously a thing to join, and he liked clubs. But I also think that when he went to somewhere like Paris, it's that instant friendship thing. You go to a foreign country, you do speak the language, but you don't speak particularly very well. You come from a country that's miles and miles away, so you're not going to know anyone there. But suddenly you've got 30 odd friends, and 30 people you can socialize with, 30 people who can introduce you to society. It must have been it's a fantastic opportunity, and which he took. And the fact that he was such a success in Paris, I think his Freemasonry must have been an important part of that, and he must have he would have seen that was a thing that he got out of it. And I also he probably enjoyed some of the things like that. He talks about one of the things that he actually said about Freemasonry. The big mystery about Freemasonry is that there's no mystery about Freemasonry. Yeah. He was one of the first people to say that, but I think maybe that he enjoyed finding that out.
But I guess clearly back then there really wasn't much history. Like you said, you've got the publicans that come to the meetings, you've got the governors. It's all kind of presented in newspapers and media. media handles and stuff. So I guess really there wasn't really much mystery back then.
No,
About what it was
no.
about.
The only thing would have been the ritual, which they would have been much stricter about, not divulging what went on in rituals.
Was he ever?
I guess that, and he may have found that enjoyable as well, because and again, it's in those days society was very much, rituals were part of everyday life. So people went to church, and it was very ritualized, and even way things like people did in colleges or society organizations and clubs, there was lots of ritual involved. I think people enjoyed it, and in the same way as people probably enjoy Masonic ritual now, I imagine that Franklin would have enjoyed that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one good thing I would say about Freemasonry that is kind of kept its legacy is that you still can go anywhere. You can still go to these different countries and not speak the language, and still know that you can go into a lodge, whether it's a native speaking lodge or whether it's an English speaking lodge. But you can still go to these countries and still have that brotherhood. I guess you call it, that Franklin probably had back then as well.
Yeah, we get one of the interesting things about working at Freemasons Hall is you see how many international Freemasons come in, to see the building because English Freemasons is so important to them, but loads of them want to visit lodge meetings. And there's always someone on standby at Grand Lodge ready to arrange that, even if it's like it's a tent where they have spare regalia in case they've got the wrong regalia or haven't brought it with them. But they always they nearly always accommodate someone. If they're from a recognised Grand Lodge to go and visit an English lodge. But it's almost a sort of a weekly occurrence, and in the summer it would be a daily occurrence, but of course the lodges don't meet in London.
Was Franklin ever part of any other clubs or any other organisations?
He was, in fact, before he was a Freemason, he was in something called the Leather Apron Club, which was sort of like an intellectual club which he found for his friends. But the fact they called themselves the Leather Apron Club was, it was almost like he was influenced by Freemasonry in that. But that was actually before he was a Freemason. And he joined a couple of clubs in London of sort of radical thinkers. But they were sort of like your gentleman's club type clubs. And of course he was a member of the Royal Society as well, which is the scientific community.
So he was just a very busy man.
He was I think anyone who was anyone in those days was in some kind of club or society.
Our last one, Martin, is from Barry Hayward from Essex Cornerstone, and he asks, is it fair to say that Freemasonry played a significant part in the American Revolution?
Yes and no. I guess so. Yes, but it could have been either way, because there were Freemasons on both sides. So the fact there were lodges in the Continental Army, and the fact that so many of Washington's generals were Freemasons, and the fact that lodges were tolerated in the army or even encouraged must have been recognised as being significant. But the fact that you had Freemasons on both sides, so obviously there was a fair amount of Freemasons in the British Army, including a future programme master. The Earl of Moira was a Freemason, but it also led to sort of a conflict American Freemasons. So after the war, you had they had the same ancients and moderns problem that we had in England. So in England, the ancients and moderns were the moderns were the early Grand Lodge. Tends to be slightly posher. The ancients were more working class, Irish, Scottish background. Of course, in England, they resolved that conflict with the Union in 1813. In America, the moderns were associated with being like Tories, which is what they called the Loyalists in America, whereas the ancients were the Scottish and Irish lodges tends to be the ones that joined the colonial army and supported the War of Independence. Classic example was Paul Revere and all the Bostonians involved in the Boston Tea Party. Most of them were a member of the same Scottish lodge in Boston, and they met in a pub which was full of potential revolutionaries, whereas ironically Franklin was a modern.
Right.
So his lodge was, most of the lodges he'd been belonged to were loyalist lodges, and of course his son, who was a loyalist, was a Freemason and was a modern, which might be why Americans, for a while after Franklin's death, didn't really acknowledge his Freemason the same way as they did with Washington. So Washington's Freemasonry is very revered and everything, whereas Franklin was on the wrong, his Freemasons were on the wrong side. And it wasn't until much later that his Freemason, the importance of his Freemasonry, a long time after his death, was acknowledged, because his Freemasons have been moderns.
Well, and I guess,
yeah, but it's a weird one, because I mean, you could say, yeah, it did have a significance, but again, maybe it didn't. but there was certainly a lot of Freemasons involved.
Yeah, well, and that's it, isn't it? I mean, you had Freemasons on both sides, so
yeah,
you know, one side did actually lose in the end, so it couldn't have made that much difference on that side, could it?
I think it was far more significant in the American Civil War, where you have instances of Masons helping each other, even people on the other side. So you have instances where people were captured and were prisoners, and they didn't particularly look after prisoners very well in the Civil War, because neither side had the facilities to do it. But there were examples of local Masons going and finding Masons who are prisoners in the local prison camps and bringing them food, because that's what you do for fellow Masons. I think another American president, I think it was Andrew Garfield. Was it Andrew Garfield? Garfield, but I can't remember his name before that. He witnessed when he was a Northern officer, and he witnessed a Northern doctor, giving Confederate prisoners some food, and he said, "Why are you giving them food?" Said, "Because I'm a Freemason, and so are they." He said, "Well, I want some of that." And he actually became a Freemason in a Confederate prisoner's lodge, even though he was a Northern officer, because he thought that he was so impressed by the Freemasons being kind to each other that he thought he wanted to join it. So I think in the Civil War, it was definitely it played a significant role in sort of bringing some humanity into a really horrible conflict.
Yeah, well, obviously there's a legacy for this moralistic kind of longevity, and actually having these behaviours kind of carry on for the years. Well, that's quite interesting. You talk.
It's sort of a civilizing influence, isn't it, or it's a sort of force for good on that front.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Martin, thank you so much for coming back on again. It's been absolutely pleasure. It's been great having you guys from the museum coming on. We've had some really good feedback for that. So it'd be amazing at some point when you got any other talks coming up or anything else, if you just get in touch, and we'd love to have you back on doing some more stuff.
Yeah, I think we've got some. We're going to aim to do some. I think either just before or just after Christmas. So watch this space.
In the loop, and we'd love to have you guys back on again for sure.
Cheers. Thank you.
All right, Martin. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.